Thanks for your patience. So I guess you've already heard some things about weathering. And you've seen, a participant observation study in it happening before your eyes. But in any case, I want to talk about its implications for health equity, which is the interest that I have had all these decades. I'm going to use as an example some things related to maternal and child health outcomes, but I could have done COVID, part of the issue about weathering is it causes just system-wide damage, and that can then be manifest in all kinds of diseases or health outcomes. So I'm sure that most, if not all of you, have heard of Erica Garner. She was a Black woman of modest means, raised in a segregated, underinvested, and thus physically decaying urban area, who became a tireless advocate for racial justice after her father, Eric Garner, I'm sure you also unfortunately have also heard of, became a victim of homicide at the hands of a New York City police officer who placed him in an unauthorized chokehold for selling untaxed single cigarettes. Her father's dying words, "I can't breathe," became a rallying cry for the Black Lives Matter movement, and Erica Garner, although initially apprehensive, became a major force in the movement for police accountability. She got very involved in activism after the death of her father. Erica Garner died at age 27 in the last days of 2017. Her own difficulty breathing due to severe asthma, itself likely produced by some combination of environmental racism, medical underservice, and race-related stressors, precipitated a major heart attack that killed her 4 months after the birth of her second child, which classifies her as a maternal death. According to her doctors, the pregnancy had stressed Garner's already enlarged heart. Conventional wisdom has us simply classifying her enlarged heart as a pre-existing condition. But we really should ask how she had an enlarged heart at age 27. Vague attributions to family history or suspected unhealthy behaviors allow many of us to not even think of that question or to gloss over that question. But I would argue it deserves interrogation, and I would further argue that the mechanisms of weathering provide a plausible and quite serious scenario. So I coined the term weathering, as I gather you already know, to describe the effects of sustained cultural oppression, exploitation, and impoverishment upon the body. Weathering expands on the more typical social determinants of health that many of you may have heard of, to instead or in addition, understand the contextually fluctuating, historically structured, and socially situated material, environmental, and biopsychosocial stressors that wear out the health of oppressed populations and shape their high-effort coping strategies. So while all of these things on this list do contribute, material hardship and its correlates that are not, salutary for health, environmental racism and socially patterned distributions of exposure to lead in your water or soil or pollution. I want to talk today the most about the structurally rooted biopsychosocial stress processes, because I think they're critical for weathering and they're understudied and under-discussed. And that's sort of what makes weathering weathering.
Bless you.
Yeah, bless you. So let me just say something about weathering. To be weathered is to be subjected to the structural challenges and existential insults that our society creates for those we marginalize or stigmatize or impoverish or disempower, while they also remain hopeful, tenacious, and motivated to mitigate, resist, or undo these barriers, even barricades, to health and social equity. So weathering posits that the health of women who are members of racialized, now I'm talking about women because we're doing MCA, maternal and child health things, but weathering applies to all gender identities and sexes. Weathering posits the health of women who are members of racialized, working class, or other systemically denigrated groups suffer stress-mediated wear and tear at a much faster pace than that of relatively more affluent white women. This is in the United States context. This is not due to any essential biological differences among racialized or other dominant compared to marginalized groups, but rather to the disparate impacts of enduring structural racism, classism, and sexism on the human biological canvas. So what I'm just pointing out here is that the inner workings of our bodies are always acting and adapting. I think some people think they're kind of just reified, but then if we see a tiger, suddenly we go into fight or flight or whatever. But the reality is you're figuring out whether it's too cold and you should shiver, or if it's, and you're not figuring it out consciously. These are all automatic processes. Or it's too hot, and so you should sweat. It's what makes you not lose your balance when you stand up from sitting. Some of us still do, but ideally you don't. It sort of calibrates itself to try to keep your body in what's called homeostasis, or in a state of kind of equilibrium in how your body is functioning, and to keep you safe from the elements, from stressors, from real danger. And that's where fight, flight, or freeze, that many of us are familiar with, is the extreme massive stress response in response to our life being threatened. So for the most part, this way that our bodies all work and do it just spontaneously. I mean, if you sort of stood there and kind of said, "Tiger's coming, what should I do?" That's the end of your life. So in small doses, and especially against very acute and finite threats, this is a very protective response. Our having it is sort of a wondrous fact, and part of why we haven't yet gone extinct as a species. But it can also, that same response can also be very damaging to your body and your health over time. And what kind of, on a social level, decides whether distributionally in your population, the stress process is more likely to be protective or damaging, is whether the stressors you face are acute or chronic. So it's just 3 minutes with the tiger, after which either what Robert Sapolsky says, you're over with, or it's, or the encounter is over one way or another. It's over in 3 minutes. But if instead you're facing chronic stressors from multiple places, whether it can be damaging more than protective. Whether you can achieve a satisfying outcome and in short order is a very big part. So we all experience some stress or things that make us angry or frustrated. But if we can deal with them. So let's say you're living in an apartment and your heat goes out in the middle of winter, and you talk to your landlord. Well, it's stressful that you're cold. It's actually environmentally stressful for you in your apartment at that point. It's also just stressful that you have to deal with this when you don't think you have time. But if you can call your landlord and mention it and he gets it fixed that day, it's not a big stressor. It's an annoyance. If, on the other hand, you're living in an apartment where the heat goes out and you're, say, in a disinvested, segregated, high poverty neighborhood, you have to think about how you're gonna call your landlord. You don't wanna be evicted for being a nuisance. But you also, even if you call him and get through to him, and I don't want to call him, but I guess a typical slumlord archetype is him. But he says he'll deal with it, and then days go by, weeks go by, maybe the whole winter goes by, and it's not dealt with. Then you're in sustained chronic stress arousal, because again, it goes back to those 3 minutes. It wasn't just a minor annoyance that maybe inconvenienced you in a day. You're now both dealing with the thermal discomfort and what that may be doing to the body, but you're also dealing with anxiety if you have, say, children or elderly parents who live with you and what's happening to their bodies. You're having to think through, what am I gonna do? How can I take the kids somewhere that has heat for the day? And you're in sustained cognitive and emotional engagement with your landlord and with the argument you have with your landlord in your head, as well as with the actual interactions with your landlord over weeks, months, whatever it takes. And that itself keeps you in this chronic state of stress arousal. So it doesn't have to be a raging beast coming after you. It can be, those kind of frustrations and reminders that you're not valued, and practical anxieties about your children and things that go on and go on. So that's why it matters whether you can achieve a satisfying outcome at all and how quickly, whether you have sufficient health support resources and power to do so. So to the extent that you are marginalized culturally, residentially, economically, or politically, you're more likely to face the more chronic and unremitting stressors that is to be subject to weathering. Over time, experience with repeated and chronic stressors and the high effort coping, that's a sustained cognitive and emotional engagement, and anxiety they entail, induce stress-mediated wear and tear on important body systems, your endocrine system, your cardiovascular system, your metabolic system, your immune system. And your systems over time become dysregulated or exhausted as their cell integrity is violated, leading to accelerated biological aging and increased general health vulnerability. And the vulnerability can be expressed in poor maternal health, which we'll talk a little bit about today, in chronic inflammation, in obesity, in depression and mood disorders, in early onset of chronic diseases like hypertension and diabetes, and increased susceptibility to some cancers and to infectious diseases. And I just want to say a little about biological mechanisms. I won't spend a lot of time on this, but I think it will become a little clearer if I say something about them. So mechanistically, the physiological stress response increases your breathing, your heart rate, and blood pressure to circulate oxygenated blood towards your large muscles quickly. That's so you can fight or flight, or flee, or freeze, sorry. And so the body activates your sympathetic nervous system, and releases stress hormones of norepinephrine and epinephrine and cortisol. This activation causes your blood vessels to constrict. That increases your blood pressure as you pump the blood to your heart and large muscles so you can fight or flee in that, if it's a really life or death fight or flee circumstance. But there are other things that happen too that you may be less aware of. Your body now breaks down the triglycerides throughout your storage fat cells to help get energy to sustain this. It also retrieves glucose or sugar, literally glycogen if you want to get technical, out of their storage sites, which is your liver and your skeleton. The cortisol, meanwhile, works to disrupt any insulin you have in the bloodstream that might have brought that glycogen back to its storage cells. And so your bloodstream is flooded with glucose, fatty acids, some amino acids that are used to fuel the muscles in the body and respond to the stressor. Now, what's also true is your immune system gets mobilized, ready for action, so that if you are, say, mauled by the tiger but not killed, you will in a better position to avoid infection of your injuries or to have them heal quickly. And the last thing that isn't often emphasized but is important to weathering in the fight, flight, or freeze response is that, well, on the one hand, you're sending all this oxygenated and full of energy and nutrients blood to your large muscles that are going to help you avoid, this life-threatening beast. You're diverting nutrients and oxygen from going to other parts of your body. Now, again, for 3 minutes, you'll survive that. But if this has happened to you day in and day out, then what this means is a few things. It means the muscles that got too much consistent oxygenated blood and nutrient-rich blood will become enlarged, will become dysregulated, while the other tissues and organs in your body will start to be damaged and atrophied because it's not getting enough nutrients or oxygen. And that's happening chronically, not just for 3 minutes once in a while, but day in and day out. And if you're pregnant, since we're going to talk about pregnancy here, a fetus is considered a complete drag on the system if you have to fight or flee. So all oxygenated blood nutrients are diverted away from fetuses for 3 minutes. Well, you might spontaneously abort, so it's not necessarily good even for 3 minutes, but mostly you'll be okay. But if this is happening chronically through your pregnancy, day in and day out, this is how you end up with low birth weight babies who are at a higher risk of dying, or preterm births, or small for gestational age babies, because the fetus has not gotten its proper nutrients. So that's all. We're done with biology, I think. But let me be sure. I don't want to make promises I can't keep. Okay, so again, the way we were designed to have the system is that your body will return to its pre-arousal functioning very quickly. And you're safe, you can take a deep breath, you can go on with your life. But when the physiological stress process is not completely deactivated, which is what happens under chronic stressors, the body experiences overexposure to stress hormones. In these cases, one state of physiological stress arousal will not recede quickly, if at all. Adverse experiences can remain physiologically stressful far beyond their actual occurrence. In effect, the toothpaste can't be put back in the tube. I want to make clear that's true even while you're sleeping. So your heart rate will stay up, your breathing rate will stay shallow, plaque will start to form in your arteries. All the things we're told are happening by having a wrong diet or an unhealthy diet. I'm not suggesting you should have an unhealthy diet, but in fact, one of the things about weathering is the same mechanisms are happening at much younger ages because of chronic stress arousal. And it doesn't, even if you're eating well. And similarly, the fact that if you're subjected to that kind of chronic stress, your stress arousal continues when you're sleeping means a couple things. It's very disruptive to your sleeping, and that's not very healthy. But also ideas that you can just simply reframe the situation or meditate or go to yoga class and make it go away. This is much too robust set of degree of damage for that to make a huge, I'm not saying you shouldn't take your yoga class, but you're not gonna in the middle of the night say, let's get up and go to yoga class. You're not gonna be able to just cognitively reframe the situation to make it good stress. So a lot of the things that we're taught would be the ways to intervene and avoid stress-related diseases work in very privileged populations who either don't suffer chronic stressors in the first place or not major ones and coming from all, parts of their life, and who have the resources to go take yoga class or to learn that meditating is good for you or whatever. So when physiological stress processes become chronic to your everyday life, your blood vessels can remain continuously flooded with fat and sugar, your immune system becomes dysregulated, you've got all these immune cells that have been mobilized, they're all dressed up but nowhere to go. And over time that dysregulates your whole system and eventually also weakens it. Your heart rate can stay high while other body organs, or as I said, your fetus, if you're pregnant, are denied their full complement of oxygen and nutrients that they need to continue to grow and develop and stay healthy. And long periods of overexposure to physiological stressors result in what's called allostatic load, or stress-mediated wear and tear throughout your body, which is associated with multi-system health vulnerability and dysregulation, damages your tissues and organs, and accelerates your cellular aging. And so, for example, if we're thinking about how you get an enlarged heart at 27, well, one model would be that chronic activation of your sympathetic nervous system causes your blood vessels to constrict. That begins to increase your blood pressure. Since it's chronic, this can lead to hypertension. Your arteries become hardened over time. They also, those immune cells that don't know where to go, the fats and sugars that have been catapulted into your system, do plaque buildup. A similar process may contribute to fibroid development or cardiomyopathy. I'm sorry, I was teaching all morning and my brain is angry at me that I'm still talking. And that can lead the muscles in the left ventricle of the heart to enlarge and thicken. Clogged circulatory systems can lead to thrombosis or emboli that can stop your heart or cause a stroke, or stop your lungs. So these are some of the ways over time, this being sort of chronically exposed to stressors that you can't resolve in short order, and because they're just literally in the air like pollution, or your landlord is just not responding to you, or for whatever reason, or because you have to code switch every day at your job to kind of, please your landlord so you don't get evicted, or please your boss, or be taken seriously. Any of these things will contribute to this chronic weathering stressors. So in other words, the same spontaneously activated physiological responses that protect us against immediate and life or death threats can be damaging if they are sustained, whether through repeated acute and chronic adverse experiences, exposures, thoughts, or protracted vigilance. And that's very important. That's the sustained cognitive and emotional engagement. That's the seeing cues and thinking you might be in danger, even life or death danger, but you're not sure. But it's not that you're being a snowflake or you're overreacting. It's that given your lived experience, you have reason to know that there's some possibility. That's how people get terrorized. There's some possibility they're going to be lynched. Any given person is probably not going to be lynched. But it's a real possibility, and you need to be mobilized against that kind of danger and threat as well. So the chronic stressors that are inherent in living in a race-conscious and inequitable society may cause Black women, and again, we're talking about women because, well, first of all, you're about to see that Black women weather more than anybody, but also because we're talking about implications for maternal and child health. So it caused Black women to experience the morbidity and mortality of white women or other dominant groups who are significantly older. So over years and decades, chronic activation of its, did I already say this? Or did I just think I said it because I've said it so many times? I'm gonna move on. I can't remember if I said this already, but you don't really need to know it. The other thing is, it's not just that over time this affects all your body systems, accelerates your cellular aging, leads you to have early onset of chronic diseases of aging like hypertension or diabetes, leads to obesity and especially abdominal obesity from all the bringing the triglycerides into your system ready to give you the energy that you would need if you were fleeing a tiger. But it's also if you've already weathered an acute stress exposure on a weathered body can result in immediate cardiac events or if you're pregnant, preterm birth. So, so I want to show you, just to give you some sense of weathering from a quantitative or concrete operational view. This is the probability of having a high allostatic load score by age, sex, and race from 2015 to 2018. And what you see, and having a high allostatic load score means you have at least 4 either actual multiple morbidities that are diabetes, hypertension, abdominal obesity, immune system dysregulation. So across different body systems, and it's sort of, it's many people see this as a way to quantify weathering. So it's not literally that this is weathering, but it is kind of an indicator of what weathering theoretically is. And what you see here is that everybody's gets higher allostatic load scores as we get older. But what I want you to especially notice is the differences by race and gender. And so, in particular, the Black women start at younger ages to go up. Their slope is steeper, and they reach the highest levels. So that this is just in young adulthood through middle age. This is sort of age 20 to 60. So we're not talking about the elderly here. But as I said, it's like there is a biological cellular accelerated aging that does go on and is part of this process. So Black women in the United States, at least in 2015 to 2018, by the time they're 60, 80% have high allostatic load, multiple morbidities, dysregulation and damage across body systems. Black men in general are kind of second, but what's interesting is white women who start off doing the best cross over and do worse than Black men. So I want you to keep that in mind as we continue. And the other thing I want to kind of highlight is that through the prism of weathering, the chronological age of 20 does not equal 20, 30 doesn't equal 30, 60 is even less likely to equal 60 when you're comparing groups that are marginalized or oppressed or impoverished or stigmatized or exploited compared to more dominant and privileged groups. And so I want to remind you that as we move to maternal child health issues, because we have a kind of folk notion that the relationship between maternal age and a poor birth outcome, whether it's to the baby or the mother dying or having some major complication, reflects a kind of some version of a U-shaped or J-shaped curve. It's driven by universal developmental processes where you're reproductively immature, say in your teens. Now people are saying even, just like we're being told our brains aren't ready till we're 26. And as you may guess from my tone of voice, I find that hard to believe. But what's interesting, over the 4 years I've studied this, it used to be the U shape was really high risks in the teens, then really low risks in the early to mid 20s, and then they start to go up a little in the 30s. Now people will talk about it as really high risks in the teens, but not getting really low risk again until about 26. So there's kind of these secular trends that just happen biologically to fit with our current sense of what's the right age to have children, what's the right kind of success sequence or demographic life course sequence to have in terms of when you have babies. So we can talk about that more if you'd like. But what graphs like this suggest, and other graphs that I'm about to show you will actually show, that belief that it's all primarily a developmental process. And I want to be clear, I'm not suggesting development has nothing to do with any of this. Certainly the older ages, you do kind of reach reproductive senescence. But it's superseded by the implications of whether, and I call our just knee-jerk belief that everything's about certain ages being immature or mature or heading to senescence. I call that age washing. I think it's an ideology that is throughout our culture, and it's a pretty good rendition of what you can expect in dominant, privileged groups. And so that's part of what keeps us believing it's really a fact, but it's really a false fact. It's not universal at the very least. So we've been age washed to believe that the relationship between maternal age and pregnancy outcomes is purely a measure of this kind of universal reproductive developmental stages. And this has informed a lot of our social policy as well as public health policy, and a belief that was especially strong in the late 80s, early 90s, and persists to this day. Maybe many of us in this room may have this belief, but it was particularly important for policies of various kinds, that if we could prevent teenage childbearing, not only would we reduce the excess rates of Black infant mortality or maternal mortality, but we would have a better society. So welfare reform was crafted very much on this thought that if we could just prevent teenage childbearing, people wouldn't be welfare dependent. And there were active measures in the original 1996 bill which tried to socially engineer there to be fewer teen births. And in public health, it's been a mainstay of how to reduce health inequities and poverty research. Clearly, we could just get people, think about it. We all believe this. It was really salient. Many of us maybe still believe it. But when you think about it, it is a kind of magical thinking that you could just get to age 20 before you have a baby. All the structured stressors in your life, all of the things that impact, developing fetuses or your ability to get an education or a job, or all the different things, or to raise children who would suddenly be wonderful citizens instead of antisocial predators. It was quite a mythology. So we worked very hard to prevent teen births. It was well funded, it was well subscribed to, and we did it pretty much. Okay. So between 1990 and 2019, you can see how far down the rates of teen childbearing went, and especially among Latinx and Black populations. So what do you think happened to infant mortality? according to what most people believed in 1990 when they started all this, it should have gone way down and there should be no inequities anymore, or much smaller, reduced inequities than there had been. But as I'm sure you're guessing, that's not what happened. And mechanistically, this is why it's not what happened. This is very low birth weight rates have gone up in those 30 years for both whites and blacks, by the way, and especially among the working class. Maternal mortality rates have gone up, and the inequities in these between black and white women and between working class and other women have either stayed stable or enlarged. In some cases, they've looked like they've gotten a little smaller, but that's because white working class women are having worse outcomes than they used to. It's not because we need the black outcomes better. So this is mechanistically how that happens. You have, this is maternal age pattern of very low birth weight. And so what you see is not that U-shaped pattern. You see a kind of anemic version of it among the whites. But you don't see it among black babies at all. In fact, what you see is the teen years are the lowest risk ages. And then risk goes up and up and up, just like allostatic load did. And so that by the time you get to the late 30s, or even if we just think about Erica Garner at age 27, you're seeing the disparities are getting bigger, not smaller. So clearly, if you sort of cut off the lowest risk ages for blacks, and then encourage more and more people, white or black, to have babies in their late 30s, or to wait till at least their 30s, you're going to end up with increased very low birth weight rates and not having done anything particularly good to the inequities, probably enlarged them. Similarly, maternal mortality. This is the pregnancy-associated mortality ratios, which is sort of considered the gold standard of measures of maternal mortality. In the US, 2017 to 2019, I want to highlight that this is before COVID, because COVID made things much worse. And so once again, you see that there's not this reverse J or whatever, or U-shaped curve, actually for anybody. There's again an anemic J for the whites. There is some actual increase at the oldest stages for childbearing, but still, its level is lower than almost any age for black moms. And then the black moms have their lowest risk ages in the late teens, and then it goes straight up. And by the time they get to the ages that we're now saying, you can confidently wait and have your babies later, they're in deep risk. And I also want to point out, because of weathering being a multi-system, we think about these pre-existing conditions, even in pregnancy. It's hypertension. It's one thing. But that's not what's happening. It's an erosion through your whole body. And so these are the main causes of maternal mortality in the 21st century. And you'll see that, again, the blue bars, which are the whites, there's not big increases in age until the 40 plus, maybe the 35 is statistically significant. But even so, even at the 40 plus for the whites is the 25 to 29, Erica Garner's age, for black women, black mothers. And it goes across all your body systems, whether the literal cause that goes on your birth certificate is maternal death due to hemorrhage, hypertension, infection from thrombotic embolism, and amniotic fluid embolism, all the cardiovascular diseases and the cerebrovascular diseases, they all increase dramatically with age among black mothers. So, and as you know from the the maternal deaths that have been highly publicized, or near maternal deaths, like Serena Williams, for example, becoming highly educated, accomplished, being physically fit, just take Serena Williams. There's probably very few people as disciplined, as physically fit, as strong, as who cares about her health. It's important to livelihood. There's also very few people who are anywhere near the level of wealth that she's in. And yet when she was pregnant at 36, she got a thrombotic embolism. And she would have died if she wasn't Serena Williams, is everybody's consensus. Because she was Serena Williams and kept pushing at the doctors and the nurses, she thought she was having this because she had them before. Finally, they did the tests that needed to be done and found, oh, you know what, you are. And so they were then able to administer treatments that saved her life. And the other point, which I started to talk about, is that growing evidence that the health of Black women, whether it's at younger ages or long dimensions that can complicate pregnancy, raises the question of possible adverse effects of delayed childbearing, as I was already saying, on maternal health equity. And we actually we published just this May in Health Affairs, if you're interested, a simulation of if we hadn't prevented teen childbearing, it's not just the teen childbearing, we hadn't prevented teen childbearing and encouraged more women to have their births later, meaning in, say, the 30s and above. The increase for working class Black women, there would have been no increase in very low birth weight births. And for working class White women, it would have been much less of an increase. And that, in fact, that secular trend, some of it policy induced, some of it just secular, towards moving maternal age distributions up, completely accounts for the excess Black rate of very low birth weight or maternal mortality. And it accounts for most of it among the white working class women. So what we thought was just an incredibly great policy that no one could disagree with, turns out not only to have been kind of a dud, but to have actually backfired and made things worse. So if we go back to Erica Garner, in her case, given her lifelong hardships and stressors, intensified by her father's brutal and very public death, and the sober and unrelenting activities she then assumed as a leader in the Black Lives Matter movement, it's easy to posit the cascade of events of whether and processes that would have led to an enlarged heart by her mid-20s and contributed to her death. The Weathering cascade obviously starts with Ms. Garner being chronically subjected to environmental, material, and biopsychosocial stressors from an early age, recalling the impacts of chronic physiological stress response on elevating heart rate, hardening and narrowing arteries, and increased blood pressure. Her heart would have needed to pump more forcefully to circulate blood and oxygen throughout her body. Eventually, this would have enlarged her heart. Her enlarged heart then places her at a greater risk of being unable to maintain a normal electrical heart rhythm and instead being vulnerable to what are called arrhythmias, which is what killed her. Through the precipitation of lethal heart attacks. The physiological requirements of pregnancy stresses any mother's body that most American 27-year-olds are able to withstand that stress, not die from it. For weathered women, pregnancy can be a stress test that pushes the limits of their weakened or dysregulated body systems. So in the weeks before her death, Erica Garner described the stress, exhaustion, and frustration that was exacted of her activism as a leader in the Black Lives Matter movement for police accountability. I'm struggling right now, she said, with the stress and everything. This thing, it beats you down. The system beats you down to where you can't win. Or as her sister Emerald Snipes Gardner described it a week after Erica's death, it was like a Jenga. They were taking out pieces, ripping her apart. And I think that's a good metaphor for weathering, that weathering is a life or death game of Jenga. And that the scaffolding appears strong as blocks are eliminated. That's the high effort coping. It remains upright as the first pieces are removed one by one. To all appearances, it continues to stand strong until the removal of that last fateful block exposes the many weaknesses of its interior and the tower collapses. So a little bit at a time, piece by Jenga piece, the assaults on the body continue to accumulate as weathering. And anyone who engages everyday life in the face of structural barriers and systemic abuse or material hardship will show physical signs of being weathered. Weathering is obviously not all or nothing. There's degrees of weathering. And any human being can weather if subjected to the conditions that precipitate weathering. So it's not something that's essential to being Black or working class or genetic. It's just being human. And you don't have to be a high-profile political activist, only a marginalized person who persists daily in the face of long odds. And so through my decades of research, I have seen how cultural oppression and exploitation move from society to cells in the bodies of people of color, working class people, impoverished people, and I'm now seeing it in work I'm doing with students in transgender people. So it's the chronic stressors that are the problem, that we create as a society and maintain through our ideologies and the false facts we believe and think are scientific. So I've seen how cultural oppression and exploitation move from society to cells in the bodies of all those different groups of people, and also some just individuals in any group who have suffered great chronic stress for whatever reason, but not the chronic stress we talk about, like this kind of deep, endless physiological stress arousal. And it takes its biggest toll on people who are not just exposed to these stressors, but who engage them, who sustain ferocious hope and determination and tenacity to continue to work hard, play by the rules, beat down the structures. And because of all of that, we see sort of towers collapsing before our eyes. And it's obviously more than time to do something about it, at a minimum to stop doing things we think are good things to do that make it worse, but to also actively make it better. So I think I'll stop here.
Thank you so much. It's a very compelling case. We had Bridget Bronner, a nurse in Pennsylvania, who kind of talked about some of this with Black infants a couple of years ago. But this is kind of broader kind of systemic approach. Our timing is a bit askew today, but I'd like to take a couple of questions if there are people who have things they'd like to ask.
Hi, thank you so much for your chat today. I was hoping you could speak to specifically with maternal and child health outcomes, the treatment of Black women in hospitals and how the bias and discrimination within the health field impacts and compounds the effects that you described today.
It adds to it, but a lot of people have stopped there and they think the Black-white inequity now is because Black women, whatever their social class is taken seriously. And there is a history of just misogyny and sexism and anti-Black racism and gynecologists in the United States. So that, to the extent we can change that, it will be helpful, but it's not the main cause. It's not, what it does do is make it harder to, like Serena, to, she presumably got her pulmonary embolism because because of her weathering from her life, and also she had it before, so even if you just want to say this is a pre-existing condition, it wasn't because of how the doctors treated her during pregnancy, but it was how the doctors treated her when she was complaining of the embolism that is why she almost died, and why people who wouldn't have the power and resources to resolve, get a good outcome quickly, would die. So I think that's a very, very real contributor, but I think we've overemphasized it, or kind of think we stop there, and if we just get doctors to, take DEI training, we'd solve these problems. Again, that's kind of another kind of magic.
Hi, Josh Ferguson, graduate student at Ross, and I'm just curious. Your research seems to be very compelling and very in depth. But as a Black man myself, as a son of a Black mother and a brother of a Black sister, what are some preventative measures for some of this? I know earlier you talked about how meditation and yoga is not going to do the job, but as someone who is going to continue to exist on this planet until my eventual untimely death, I would like to sort of have some hope that there are ways to prevent this other than solving systemic racism, which that would be nice.
Well, first of all, I've written a book, and the whole second part is about that, so you could take a look at that beyond what I'm about to say now. But I think there's not that much as individuals we can do, because this is systemic and due to structural and ideological racism. So we have to instead work on social movement activities, policies that don't make things worse, but make them better. We have to my goal in writing the book or in talking at places like this is to have us kind of look through a weathering lens and think about from our own perspectives and expertise and lived experience, what would be the things people could do. That's sort of the next step and the important step. And I've kind of taken a few baby steps in that direction, but I don't claim to have the answer. But what is good in quotes, about weathering being just all omnipresent, the causes of weathering, is that you can kind of do something in anything you're doing. There's a whole work on how you can reduce, say, stereotype threat in classrooms just by changing the setting or the words on the syllabus, or the professor says on the first day of class. We've thought about that just in terms of you won't have your performance reduced on tests and in class by being subject to stereotype threat. But what being subject to stereotype threat does is it arouses your physiological system. That is in fact why you don't perform as well, because your cognitive neural networks are not being engaged in favor of your effective ones. And so in classrooms, we can kind of make the places and settings where people get this dose of weathering or that dose of weathering fewer about them. We don't know enough scientifically about what's the biggest dose or what would be the most effective. But there are a range of things I actually call this Jedi public health, where we're concentrate on changing settings rather than individuals changing their behavior, and so that we don't, in all these different settings, arouse the stress reaction. The other thing an individual can do is, if you know you're in one of the groups that experiences this, get your physicals, check your blood pressure. You may as well do the healthy eating stuff and the meditating, because there's no one saying any of that's bad. And so you can still do some of the same things you would do anyway to try to be healthy, but being aware, that you could have, you wanna be aware of two things. You wanna be aware of one, no matter what you do, you are not responsible for your weathering. It's not your, obviously you wanna take whatever action you can to diminish, disrupt, or even prevent weathering. But ultimately, this is a social project, not an individual one. And you wanna access the medical services that you might be more likely to need, because you may have weathering. So I know that's not a satisfactory answer, but that is best for now. That is reality.
Thank you.
I kind of wanted to speak to that a little bit also in terms of, some of the things I was looking at in past work and like the work of your kind of like descendants. And in terms of like, I feel like that's also where the limitations of like me and Arlene meet, like you know what feels good and like what protects you. And I think that's the thing is like policies and society like put forward other ideals. So like thinking about not just sort of like maternal and child health policy, but like liberal notions of integration and like in like trying to like, predominantly white institutions. And sort of like there's research that shows like metabolic syndrome is like one of the kind of like measures of weathering is far lower among Black folks who go to HBCUs. And like, and other kind of like ways of like, what you've called autonomous protections in your work, but just sort of like the things that, and also some work by Danya Keene on like public housing. Like public housing has been demonized in the United States and also physically eroded by policy. But the policies that we put in place that took away public housing, made it mixed income, pushed forward ideals of integration while also taking away basic needs, disrupted social networks that were developed for people's survival, and have exacerbated the effects of weathering. So I think that I have like a little bit of a different take, but I think it's similar.
Oh, it is. It's like in the 90s, there was this word many of you probably have, especially if you're studying poverty, have come across called the deconcentration of poverty. And this was this whole idea that people living in these disinvested high poverty areas had no there were no good resources, there was no moral compass in these areas. The middle class had moved out, so they had no role models. So they just created what was called a tangle of pathology. And that's why there were all these problems in these high poverty urban areas. But if you think about it through a weathering lens, you realize what you're doing, besides kind of blaming the victim, et cetera, and misspecifying the problem altogether, you're adding to the denigration and the ideology that fuels anti-Black racism. You're fragmenting networks, which are your source of social support and all practical support of various kinds. And so thinking about what are the positive things that help, or what we might call protective factors. Both the welfare reform in 1996 and all these deconcentration of poverty programs like Hope 6 and others, they exacerbated these problems, not help them. But if instead, as more and more urban planners are doing now, you do agree that because of the disinvestment and racism that these high poverty areas have been neglected and have a lot of stressors and poverty and et cetera in them. But what you do is come up with solutions that don't move the people out, but improve the environments of the people and the opportunities. There's a concept called wellness-based development, which is where urban planner activists are working. There's one example is Vital Brooklyn, which is in New York City, where you make coalitions and contracts that are like labor contracts with labor unions, with hospitals, so that and with local educational institutions, so that you at the same time improve, sort of green the city and improve its environment It's built environment, it's air environment, but you're also keeping resources, bringing resources and skills to the residents, and you're not fragmenting the support networks.
We could keep going, and your brain would never get a rest. But I just want to thank you so much for this wonderful presentation, for all the kind of